Good to go. All right. Well, good morning again, everyone. To reintroduce, I'm Geoff Simon, Executive Director of the Western Dakota Energy Association, and we're having an encore webinar this week because initially our recording didn't work, but we were able to actually manufacture one with recorded audio. So if you look on the ndenergy.org, the Western Dakota Energy Association website, you will find that there is a link to last week's audio and the slides combined in a YouTube video. With me is Brent Bogar. Brent is a business consultant for the Western Dakota Energy Association. He operates a company called Jadestone Consulting and is also employed with AE2S as a financial consultant. To reacquaint you with Brent, in case you don't know, he is a former Williston City Commissioner and has a background in the banking industry. We affectionately call Brent the numbers guy, and good reason for that, because the guy really knows numbers. You should see him work a spreadsheet sometime in Excel. He was actually the brains behind Operation Prairie Dog, which passed in the 2019 legislature. Senator Wardner shepherded the bill through, of course, but Brent was kind of the brains behind it, put together all the buckets in that formula, which we're going to be discussing here in the course of the webinar. He'll talk through some various oil price and production scenarios. And just to give you an idea, the numbers have been updated a little bit. Brent is continuously tweaking his model as new information becomes available. I know some of you have requested via email specific information about your particular political subdivision. Brent's not ignoring you. He just wanted to make sure that the information is as updated and accurate as possible. If you want to advance to the first slide, the first thing we want to do is kind of give you a snapshot of, kind of where we are at today. This hasn't changed a whole lot from last week's webinar, other than the active drilling rig count. As of late yesterday afternoon, we were down to 36 rigs. That's down almost 20 rigs already from where we were just less than a month ago now. And a lot of production has been shut in. In conversation with the Petroleum Council, that's a combination of a lot of marginal wells, and a few of the bigger wells are being shut in, and expectations are we're going to see more wells shut in just because the production has no place to go right now. Demand has fallen off that much. Brent was telling me before we started the webinar, in conversation with Justin Kringstad, that the state's transportation differential is increasing to, in some cases, up to $15 a barrel off WTI, simply because, again, the oil has no place to go. We're filling up storage capacity very quickly, and that likely will force more shut-ins. We've also seen, obviously, a lot of layoffs in the industry out there. 25,000 unemployment claims filed as of last Friday, and I expect we'll see updated numbers later on this week as more claims are filed. Whiting Petroleum, did seek Chapter 11 protection and reorganization bankruptcy, and analysts in the industry say we may see some more of that coming. Naturally, all of it kind of depends on the duration of both the oil price war, which we're going to talk about later in the webinar, as well as the duration of the pandemic itself and how long the economic shutdown continues. We don't know exactly where we're headed, but there is some cause for optimism. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but right now I'm going to pass it over to Brent, who's going to explain the gross production tax distribution formula first, and then kind of walk you through some projections about where we think we're headed.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. And as Geoff shared, as I work on this model, we're constantly getting more information as I reach out to industry and state officials. And so some of the numbers in today's presentation are a little different than last week, and that is going to constantly change. None of it is significant enough to make us go, holy cow, that really changed something, but it's just basically improving on things. Instead of rounding it to the million place, we're down to the $100,000 place, those types of things. So just know that if you compare the presentation that was given today compared to last week, some of the numbers are a little different, and that's just as more information becomes available. So as we talk about the oil tax, again, I like to go through both taxes, the extraction tax and the gross production tax, and how these impact the different things in the state. We have the extraction tax first. That is, majority of the funding of the extraction tax goes into various constitutional funds, the legacy fund being the largest fund at 30%. Resources trust fund, this biennium is 20.5%. That is normally 20% or has been 20%. That extra 0.5% of extraction taxes to make up some funds that were not deposited from trust lands on Fort Berthold over the last couple of bienniums, basically. I guess I'll call it a small accounting difference between how the treasurer was looking at things, how other agencies were looking at things. So they came up with this model to make that change. Foundation aid and common school, each 10%. And then the remaining 30% of extraction fund goes into the state funds or the buckets, as we'll talk about later. Gross production tax then, which is the primary focus of this webinar, as that's where the political subs receive their funding. Again, 30% off the top does go to the legacy fund. Then it's split 1/5 and 4/5, with the 1/5 being what we've affectionately termed the state share. And then the 4/5 is where the local political subdivision funding comes from. And on that 4/5 side, the first $5 million in any county of gross production tax, 100% of that funding stays in that county or to those political subs. So whether that's counties, cities, or schools. And then over 5 million, if you have over 5 million in gross production tax, then it's split counties, cities, schools, but then it also gets into the townships and the hub cities and hub city schools. So there's two different formulas of distribution there, under 5 million and over 5 million. And then the remaining funds go into the buckets. So gross production tax and extraction tax both are used to fill the state buckets. And we'll talk about those here in just a little bit, what those buckets are and what they look like. On the GPT forecast, as I talked about, there is the 1/5 side, the state side. That's where the Reclamation Fund and the Heritage Fund both receive their money, and the rest of the 1/5 side goes into the buckets. On the 4/5 side, the under 5 million, you can see the difference in split there. Counties get 45%, cities 20, and schools 35. When I go to the over 5 million, that's where the counties get 60%, cities 20, but then the schools are at 5, townships, the hub cities, and the hub city schools all get a little bit. So there is some changes there. The big one being the schools going from 35 down to 5. That's why there's that school hold even bucket that you see there on the fixed funding. That money is to make up for that difference, because if you're a school district in a county that is just over that $5 million, say that you're $6 million, well, 35% of 5 million is a lot more than 5% of 6 million. So that school hold even is basically to make sure that you do not go backwards in the funding for a school district, just because your county crosses over that threshold. So then this is all of our oil tax allocations. This has not changed. This is based on the legislative forecast in regards to where the revenues were going to go from the oil taxes. Legacy fund, nearly $1.3 billion. Political subs, $661 million. And then on down, you can see tribal share, 525. That is changed in regards to how that was calculated this last biennium. Legislation was changed in regards to the formula there. So the tribal share did increase a little bit over previous bienniums in regards to what they're getting because of the tax share agreement. The buckets then, which are part of that whole distribution, but as the extraction tax and the gross production tax flow through and it gets down to those, the state share, it goes into the buckets. And you can see there where extraction and gross production tax has a larger share going into the buckets. That's primarily because you have that 1/5 side almost completely flowing through, because it's only $30 million of the gross production tax on the 1/5 side that is taken out before it all flows into the buckets. But we have the general fund, 200 million, county social services, 200 million. Again, county social services, by statute, that's actually called the property tax relief fund. I rename it personally the county social services fund, because that is the bucket that they then transfer those dollars out of that to fund for the county social services that was taken over by the state for funding, in then requiring the counties then to eliminate that mill levy. Then we have the budget stabilization fund, $75 million. That fund is full, so not the full $75 million was needed there to fill the budget stabilization fund. That's sitting at about $760 million now. The general fund, another 200 million. That right now, as we look at the tax revenues and the collections by the state, currently that is the bucket being filled. So the first general fund and the county social services, budget stabilization, those have all been filled. We're now filling that budget, that next general fund bucket. Next after that would be $10 million to the lignite research, the disaster relief fund. Zero will go into that fund as of now, because it is at its statutory cap. As I always say, that there is a caveat because of the potential of disasters like the flooding last fall and the potential yet this spring. Some of that money could be taken out of disaster relief, meaning a little bit might need to go in there. But as of now, there would be zero out of the buckets going into the disaster relief fund. Next is the municipal infrastructure fund. This is the first prairie dog bucket, $30.4 million. This goes to the larger communities, cities over 1,000 in population, and it is based on the formula of Operation Prairie Dog, utilizing valuation changes, population changes that determine where that funding goes. So the larger the city, the larger the chunk of that, but it does go down all the way to some of our smaller communities, even communities in the oil producing region, but not the big 9. If you're in, like, I'll use Ward County for an example. Now, Minot does not get any money there because they are a hub city, so they receive their funding through the hub city formula. But like Burlington in Ward County, they would receive some Operation Prairie Dog funds in this infrastructure bucket here. Obviously, the Fargos, Grand Forks, Bismarcks get the largest portion of that money. That bucket, based on all of the models that I've ran, does fill, but I would caution any community from counting on that money, because it will not fill until well after into next legislative session. And so I would not necessarily be counting on any of those dollars at this point. Strategic Investment Improvement Fund, that next 400 million, that's really the bucket that we need to see fill, that will not fill. That 400 million in the past, has that amount from the SIF has been used to balance the general fund. They've transferred it out of the SIF to the general fund to balance the general fund. And so without that filling, there's going to have to be some maneuvering by the state in regards to the general fund. If it were to fill, based on if we weren't having to deal with all of the price and production changes, next up would be the county and township infrastructure of 30.4 million. That is prorated out again. And the reason that bucket is there to that is that then the county and townships get 30.4, and after that, the cities, county and township buckets are treated equally, dollar for dollar. So there's how that works. And then again, if those buckets fill, it's prorated out based on the formulas. Counties and townships, the formula there is the Upper Great Plains needs study. Then 20 million for airports, and anything left would go into the SIF. Again, in our current environment, we're not getting down to those buckets, but that's how it is designed. And intentionally, these buckets were designed this way so that if the revenue was short, the priorities are taken care of first in regards to the state's needs. So that's how the buckets are structured. And so you could argue that it's working exactly as designed in regards to making sure that the state's obligations are the priority before the state sending funds out to the additional dollars out to the local political subs outside of the other funding that the state provides through the state aid formula, highway distribution fund, those types of things. So, and obviously we know all of those are going to be taking a hit as well. And so there's a lot of changes in regards to revenues at the state level and then that flowing down to the local level. So now to get into the scenarios that I worked on, 4 scenarios plus the legislative forecast. You can see some different nuances to each scenario, but what I did is then just easier to compare on an average basis versus looking at all of the different ways, because at the end of the day, the average is what gives us the big number for making the comparisons to. But we have legislative forecast of $1.42 million or barrels per day with a 48.25 average price for the biennium. Scenario 1, production drops down to just a little over 1 million barrels a day and an average price of $29.70. Scenario 2, we have a drop in the oil price and production going down to 1.18, so not quite as much, and the price being a little bit more dynamic. So that's kind of the changes in these scenarios, is really how quickly the price changes and having varying dynamic factors in there for those changes of when production declines and price, which gives us some different looks on this.
It's important to understand here, I think, that we're talking about average production over the 2-year biennium, because, you know, with the current scenario, we're looking at, you know, if you look in the first left-hand column, production there, you know, it's quite conceivable production could drop down to about 1 million barrels a day or perhaps even less. But then we're talking about, you know, up to this point, we've been 1.4 million or above. So we're, you know, 9-10 months into the biennium. It still will average out to 1.1 million. And that's kind of what you need to look at, considering the revenue you got today. And you'll explain that too about going forward, how much you're going to be seeing decrease.
Yeah. So this is not, say, as you can see, even in looking in the scenarios, you can see like scenario 1, as Geoff was talking about, this is the average. When you look at the details of scenario 1, leveling off at actually 800,000 barrels a day. It's because we have the higher production for the first months of the biennium that we wind up with an average still above that 800,000. So that's where the scenarios come in at. Scenario 3, again, 1.1. This is where we really got into some more dynamic pricing using the NYMEX futures, less the 15% discount. As Geoff mentioned, right now our discount is well above 15% because there's not the demand out there, and oil is being produced in other markets that is closer, and so there are the discounts that we're being offered on North Dakota crude is much steeper at this point in time. So this is what that means as you put this into the formula in regards to gross production tax for all of the local political subs. And you can see 661 million was the forecast for the political subs as we looked at that earlier going through the formula flows. Scenario 1 down to scenario 4, 342 to 410 million. Obviously, we would all love to see scenario 4 or better, but we need to be preparing for some of these other scenarios as well. What it amounts to is somewhere between a 40 and 50% reduction total in that production. Now, one of the things before I get into some of the examples, first is I'm a visual person, so I like to throw the charts out there. This is based on legislative forecast. We're going to basically be somewhere between $25 and $30 million a month going out to political subs over the biennium. You can see how with these scenarios, how that dramatically changes. And based on how I built the models, that's why not everything follows the same. Some of them have a little bit more of a, not quite as steep of a decline, because production and price takes a while to catch up. And we also recognize that A, revenues trail, and B, we don't have any good information in regards to how much is on contract versus how much is on spot price. And so there's a number of nuances in there, and that's why we built the model with some of these varying changes. But it is going to be a steep decline as we see this. Excuse me. And to note, this is based on biennium. I should adjust this because it actually does not start in July, just to give people a little bit better idea. The biennium starts July 1, but oil taxes are collected 2 months behind and then are distributed that third month. So really it would be September would be the start of this. And so while we look at this at a biennial basis, the oil tax revenue formulas and distribution formulas trail the actual state's biennium. So it starts in September, not in July like the rest of the state. And that gets a little tricky, but when you're looking at numbers, that really means instead of having July through February at that higher level, it's actually September through February at the higher level. So that's really just an access issue on my slide that I need to adjust there. But just to help clarify some of that information and what that means. So getting into some examples for the political subs, the first are the hub cities and hub city schools. And as we look at these, they do not have nearly the decline. You're not seeing that 40 to 50% decline. And that is because in the formula, there is a bucket that they receive funding. They receive part of their funding through a 9% of the gross production tax out of the political subs in the 30% split. But they also have a bucket that is funded 70% by the state and then 30% locally. So part of their monies are coming from the state, and that money is what we've called a fixed bucket. So they're getting a fixed amount. That was basically for the hub cities in regards to them being able to ensure that they can meet their obligations for debt payments, that fixed bucket of funding for the hub cities. So that fixed bucket does not change because it's not tied to price and production, whereas part of their funding is. So they do see a reduction, but it is not at that same level. The counties, though, that all is tied to price and production. And so you can see the numbers here do trend, to that 40 to 50% reduction. And recognize too that these numbers are averages. Throughout the biennium, one of the things that does change compared to what legislative forecast is, legislative forecast looks at production, percentage of production, and all of that for a county, and it's fixed for the entire biennium. Well, every month, production values change in each counties, and the formula, the distribution, is actually based on real and not the average or what legislative council plugged in there. And so, for example, Dunn County was at around 18% production. Now, this last month, they were over 19% production. At one point, McKenzie County was 41% of state oil production. The last numbers was around 39.5%. So they change. And so these numbers are a little bit more dynamic in regards to if you were to compare this to what your actual distributions truly are. Know that these tables, even the hub cities, it is a little bit variable based on some of those changes, but this is a good base point to start from. Now, this next slide is looking at some cities. This is where we added some more information to show what it means for cities. We looked at the counties. I broke it down and I pulled out cities across the big 9 producing counties. And we've got Watford City from McKenzie, Stanley from Montreal, Tioga. Then I threw in some of the other cities like Bowbells, Crosby, Belfield, Bowman, because they're not in the core area, and so their changes aren't quite, we wanted to make sure that they could see how this might impact them as well during this downturn. So this is just, again, some examples, as Geoff mentioned, and I did receive a number of emails from political subs. If you have, I will be getting those responses back to you in the next couple of days. But I was focused on getting some of this information updated and didn't respond. But if you did ask for information, I will get it back. If you want specifics for your community, feel free to email me or Geoff, and he can get back to me, and we'll definitely get you that information. And if you want to visit about it, if there's a group of you that want to visit, we can. I had a call yesterday, visited with Geoff. We're going to be looking at putting together kind of a working group of community leaders out as our members of Western Dakota Energy to start looking at some ways, some ideas that we might be able to approach the state in regards to helping to offset some of these significant changes in funding, and how cities and counties, schools can adjust for that change. And I won't get into the details in regards to some of the ideas, because I want everyone to think about that. Geoff will probably be sending out information today or tomorrow regarding, if you're interested in being in that working group, to let us know, and then we'll set up a call and start that discussion early next week. So these are just some ideas. Again, it changes based on the production level, the taxes, but it does have some significant impact for even down to the cities. So.
Well, just to kind of talk about maybe some cause for optimism a little bit here. We talked about in last week's webinar that the Saudis and the Russians were going to get together. That is actually happening today. That virtual meeting, as they call it, they're not having a face-to-face meeting, but they are getting together to discuss production cuts. We're optimistic that that could amount to about 10 million barrels a day. And really, you know, it has to affect countries, oil-producing countries all over the planet, because if you look at the bullet farther down the list, the International Energy Agency expects global demand to drop off 20, but some say now 30% this year, as economies continue to be pretty much in a state of lockdown, and you know, people just aren't traveling. Airplanes aren't flying that much. The only thing that's really still going is the trucking industry, because we obviously need you know, to continue the supply chain out there. But it's hoped that the Saudis and OPEC nations and Russia will knock off, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10, maybe even 15 million barrels a day. To put it in perspective, global demand last year for 2019 was about 100 million barrels a day. And last report I heard, we are down about 30%. We're on pace to be about 70 million barrels. So whether we want to or not, that production is going to have to come down. And it already has here in North Dakota. Obviously, the same thing is happening in Texas, simply because we're running out of places to put it. The refineries are full up, and there just isn't that much storage for the oil. So production is inevitably going to come down. There are some, you know, some talk about asking the United States to put tariffs on foreign imports, so we just stick with our domestic crude oil, but no action has been taken in that regard yet. In Texas, they've talked about a statewide mandate, or some sort of statewide quotas, production cuts, so that the pain is shared. Everybody takes an equal haircut among the producers. Don't know that that's going to happen, but some of them are talking about that. And then regarding the pandemic itself, President Trump has extended the social distancing guidelines through the end of this month. We heard this morning that Minnesota has pushed them into May, their statewide lockdown from Governor Walz in Minnesota. And kind of want to talk about, you know, Governor Burgum has taken some heat not mandating a lockdown, that basically it's not a mandatory shelter in place in North Dakota. It's guidance only. And, I think, but from the most part, that's working out there. A lot of businesses have adjusted to it. They've instituted curbside service. There are 6-foot spacings in a lot of the chain stores out there now. I even heard that now they put beepers on the shopping carts so that if you get within 6 feet, it's like a horn sound. So you don't get within 6 feet of someone in, I think it was at Target, my wife said. So some of those things are happening. We don't know how long this is going to continue. But the one thing we talked about in last week's webinar, and I want to mention again today, unless by some miracle a vaccine is developed in the very short term, and no one is suggesting that's going to happen. We're probably at best a year out for a vaccine for the coronavirus. We need to develop herd immunity. Flattening the curve reduces the demand on hospitals. But Brent and I had this conversation yesterday. Right now in North Dakota, we've got 16 people hospitalized with this virus, and we've got something in the neighborhood of 2,600 beds available. So we'll see what happens with the lockdown, but to develop that herd immunity, eventually most of the population has to be exposed to this. Many people will be asymptomatic. We saw that in the testing that was done in Gladstone and Amadon last week. There were 6 positives that came out of that though too, but some of those people were asymptomatic. So we just kind of need to see where it goes from there. We're going to kind of keep an eye on this, and as was suggested last week, we'll probably have another one of these webinars in a few weeks, and we will be sending out an email to kind of form a working group of the leadership and some of the political subs that are interested in discussing with the state how to deliver some support to the communities, because these are substantial revenue reductions, and they're not going to be easily absorbed. And we obviously don't want to be losing, municipal, county, school services, obviously. So we need to figure out a way to sustain that. So that concludes what we have prepared. And if any of you have questions, it's possible to type them in through the webinar, the Zoom program here. So we'll stand by if there are any questions. Do you have any there, Brent?
We got a couple. One, yes, we will be posting the presentation. The one from last week is out on the association's website, ndenergy.org. And so we will be posting this out there so that you can get that information. And this was recorded this time. We got the recording to work this time. Fingers crossed, I guess I should say, because we're not done yet. But it will be out there, so you can get that, share that with anyone that's not able to join. Second question, someone mentioned, how much worse would our differentials be without the DAPL pipeline? Hugely, considering, especially now with our production cuts where they're at. Basically, half of our oil production is going through DAPL. If DAPL didn't exist, you're probably looking at another at least couple, if not up to $5 more.
And it obviously would help if that expansion was online, so we could move more oil through the DAPL pipeline. But that's probably a year off at best right now with the recent court decision.
Yeah, and DAPL obviously takes a good chunk of our production. One of the things with that is and that's been a great benefit to the state, but we need to see continued development of those types of infrastructure projects so that we have options, our producers have options to go to other markets. That's where rail did open up additional markets that we didn't have pipelines to. And so there are still needs for those infrastructure developments. Obviously, those types of projects are going to slow down right now because there's not going to be the capital out there to invest in those types of projects. But we do need to continue to see that. I would, on a side note to that note, for all of the political subs out west, especially the big producing counties, but all of you, is centrally assessed properties are probably going to take a pretty good hit, especially because pipelines are centrally assessed and their valuation is based on what is flowing through them. And so if oil's down 50% on price, it's not necessarily that you're going to see a 50% reduction in that valuation of that centrally assessed, but we are going to see declines there. So not only are you going to see your gross production tax have a reduction, you're probably going to see sales tax reduction because there's not as much activity in your county or city, but also centrally assessed property is going to go down. So as you're looking at budget adjustments, you'll definitely need to be thinking about that. Another question regarding the hold harmless funds for the schools. I have a question into the state treasurer regarding that distribution and how that's calculated. It's a very complex formula. The way that I read that is that hold harmless money is kind of a fixed bucket, very much like the hub cities. But I want to verify that. So for those counties that are receiving those funds, which that would be Divide, Bowman, Burke, Billings, and Stark, I will confirm that answer regarding that school funding and that hold harmless funding for those schools, what that looks like. My read is that it's a fixed bucket, but I need to confirm that with how the treasurer is actually interpreting that for that. So there was a question on that. One of the email questions from last session was kind of the same thing. And so I do have a question and have not heard back from the treasurer's office on that one. But we'll share that information when I get that answer.
A couple more.
So question from Divide County being outside of the core area, do we anticipate seeing more shut-ins in that area because they're the fringe or the lower producing? As Geoff mentioned in some of his conversations, and I've had the same types of conversations with other individuals, it's really hard to say. I do think that obviously, whether it's shut-ins in like a Divide County, there is the potential to see a greater drop there. I don't know that they'll necessarily shut them in, but the decline curves, there's obviously not going to be more drilling in those counties. We're already down to 36 rigs, and those are all in the core counties now anyway. We're going to see, you'll see that decline potentially in those non-core areas be a little bit steeper. But we're also seeing reports of some of the bigger producing wells being shut in, basically from a savings standpoint. Why produce 1,000 barrels a day at 20 bucks, even WTI? Why not shut that well in and wait till that price rebounds so that you get a bigger paycheck then? So that's where, as we see this evolve and reports come in, we'll track that. Now, one of the things that will help us is the State Land Board met, was that yesterday? Yesterday. If a well has state acreage underneath it, the companies actually have to notify the state that they're doing that they want to shut it in. And there's roughly, I believe she said 7,500 wells.
Big chunk of them.
Yeah, so basically half of our producing wells the state has an interest in. So there'll be, as that information starts coming forward, we'll be able to get a better idea of how the industry is making decisions on shut-ins. But I do anticipate those fringe areas to basically, whether or not they shut them in, but there's not going to be more production. So yes, that's a long answer for Divide County to say I would anticipate potentially a little bit steeper decline in revenues for those fringe counties.
It's a difficult call for any company. I mean, they want to try to preserve their employee base because at some point we're going to come through this, so they've got to maintain a little bit of cash flow. But at the same time, if you're getting under $20 a barrel for the product, you really don't want to do that too much.
Yeah, and there was a article yesterday that I read with the business and economics professor from UND who believes that this kind of downturn and the recovery part, he believes the recovery will be faster in the Bakken than it was from the 2014-15 decline, because we have more of an employee base here. And so it'll be easier for companies to ramp back up versus trying to find employees. Obviously that's his guess. I think there's a lot of factors that play into what a rebound in recovery will look like beyond just employee base. So take that into consideration.
Yeah, we know the companies out there are trying to maintain payroll if they can. I rather than laying people off, I've heard reports that hours have been reduced. So, some employees may be only working half time, but it's something. They're at least employed. I mean, it's going to be it's a struggle. And yep. I feel the pain out there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I anticipate that we'll see more stories like Whiting, bankruptcies, remember, are obviously no one likes to go through them, but sometimes that's just the only way that company has to force their creditors' hands in being able to renegotiate. It's not necessarily that they're going to close up shop and completely disappear. But we could see some acquisitions, we could see some consolidation, and there's a lot of different things. And we saw that in 2015-16 movement. So keep that in mind. Another question regarding schools. Yes, I am working on schools. Schools is the reason I didn't include a slide this time is because schools get a little bit more nuanced, especially as they get into certain school districts where they cross over into multiple counties and tracking that production. But I will be working on a table for schools. And if you, as a school district, specifically want information, please email me. I'll add you to the list so that I can get you specific information. But right now, I am working on getting that school. Question on how low can production go before we see gas plants shut in? I don't know that we'll see, I haven't talked to like One Oak, obviously our largest producer and gas plant operator, but considering how much was being flared, I think the gas plants are going to be safe. We've already seen One Oak basically call off some expansions. And so I think that gas, my assumption is going to be, and this is just a guess, I haven't looked into it and talked to people in depth on the gas side, but my assumption would be is that we're obviously going to see some flaring numbers. The amount of flaring go down because production goes down on gas, but we have the infrastructure in place to process that gas. We would have to drop pretty significantly, I think, before we see any gas plants stop operating. They may not be able to operate at full levels, but I think they'll all continue to operate. So checking here if there's any other questions. So far, nothing else. Do want to, again, encourage anyone, if you have questions, if you have any comments or ideas of what you'd like to see included in the future. We're not necessarily going to do this on a weekly basis. We felt like doing this encore was critical this time around because there were a number of people that got to us that said, hey, we were unable to be on the first one because we had a meeting and no one was able to attend. So we wanted to get something out there, an option for everyone. But I do anticipate probably by the end of April doing this again in another 2 or 3 weeks with some updated information. So if there's things that you would like to see us incorporate in this to share with everyone, please let me know, and we'll see how we can accommodate that.
And again, we'll be sending an email to everyone. If you want to participate in a working group, we're going to try to work with the state to address some of the impacts in the communities out there. We've got CARES dollars coming into the state here at some point,
Yep.
and we want to make sure that those are allocated most effectively for everyone's benefit.
And that's just so everyone within our Western Dakota Energy membership knows, I am tracking that, have been reading up on that. Interestingly, it's kind of like the PPP, the payroll protection loan program that came out. When the bill passed, there was all of these articles and information out there as to who qualified and how it worked. And then another organization that I work with applied for a loan. We filled out the application on Tuesday, and on Thursday we had to redo the application because the SBA changed it because the rules weren't finalized yet. They are still working, so that program's been finalized, but the CARE dollars to the state, which North Dakota will receive at a minimum $1.25 billion, they are still at the federal level writing the rules as to what qualifies and how the states can use those dollars. And so as you hear things about that, just recognize that there's nothing solid on that right now. I am tracking that to see how that will work, if it can be used for revenue replacement because of lost revenues because of the virus, or if it has to be spent on actual things that have been bought because of the virus, expenses. And so there are a lot of nuances there. Will the state use it to augment just state resources, or will they push that down through the political subs, whether that's through the state aid distribution formula, those types of things? It's all up in the air right now, and I've had conversations with state leaders on that, and they're still waiting to get some guidance from the feds. So we're tracking that, and we'll provide information as we get solid information and not rumor.
Hopefully by the time the next webinar comes around, we'll have a whole lot better handle on what's going to happen.
Yes. So with that, we will end for today. Again, Geoff's email, my email are up there on the screen for you to send questions to or comments. We appreciate everyone taking part in this and giving us the opportunity to provide some information to you.
Thanks all. Stay healthy.